All right, well, welcome to War in the Constitution. This is number 11 in the series that I do, the In the Constitution series, and I've intentionally placed this war presentation at the end. There's a lot that we've thought about and learned about in war, and our perspective may be changed today, hopefully will be changed a little bit as we look at what the Constitution itself has to say about war. I want to be very clear up front that I very much respect and honor those brave men and women who have been placed in harm's way. I honor them, those who are currently serving, who have served. There may be some critiquing today that we talk about some of the issues surrounding war of the leaders who have placed them in harm's way. And so I want to make the distinction there. Anything I say today, I hope will never be construed to say that I'm not pro-troop or pro-America or pro-armed forces. I very much am. But I'm very much also for the proper role of war and what the Constitution has to say about its role. So we'll get started. We'll start talking about definitions. That's where we always start. So two terms that are often thrown around is this idea of isolationism and non-interventionism. A lot of people like to say, well, those are the same things. But let's look at their definitions. Okay, isolationism is to not have any dealings with foreign nations. Isolationism says we're going to stick our head in the sand and disregard the fact that we live in the world. Okay, and it's kind of a derogatory term, right? Whereas non-interventionism is defined as not getting involved in the affairs of foreign nations. Non-interventionism says we're not going to go and meddle in the affairs of other nations. It's not our issue, it's their issue, okay? Now, we could talk a ton about that, the implications of those, but we're not going to. We're simply going to define what isolation is and what non-intervention is, two distinct terms. The next definition is this idea of preemptive war. Now, this has a lot of political undertones as well. We're not going to get into that. We're going to just stick at the definition. Preemptive war is defined as being the first to break the peace, the initiation of armed conflict, an offensive act of aggression, making war without being attacked first. So if you engage in preemptive war, you are the first to attack. Okay? Now, like I said, there's some political undertones there. We're not going to really get into that. Just wanted to clarify what preemptive war means. And lastly, the definition of war itself. Okay? War is a conflict carried on by force of arms. So we hear about the war on drugs, okay, or the war on poverty. And it's semantics, but it kind of reduces that word war, to not mean that much. Okay? But war is something that's very dramatic. War involves a conflict carried on by force of arms. It involves killing. It involves human beings shooting at each other. And we need to understand that's what war is, okay, as far as definitions go. Now, today we're talking about war in the Constitution, but I wanted to make sure we understand there's three distinct terms we're going to focus on, okay? We're going to talk about war, but we're also going to talk about national defense and foreign policy. Those three things are intertwined in this idea of war, but they're actually three distinct ideas as well that we're going to explore and look at definitions and constitutional references to those three distinct separate issues as well. Okay, so is war ever justified? Yes, there's justification for war. In 3rd century Christendom, a lot of the Christian leaders got together and said, look, we've been fighting wars for centuries. People are always killing each other. We need to get together and decide on what is a justified war. And what they came up with is something called the just war theory. The just war theory has 8 principal features. The first one is this: the idea that defensive war alone is legitimate. The damage inflicted by the aggressor nation must be lasting, grave, and certain. Okay, there's a quote by Martin Luther that I like. That's really an interesting one. He says, "At the very outset, I want to say that whosoever starts a war is in the wrong. Let it be the first thing to be said in this matter. No war is just, even if it is a war between equals, unless one has such a good reason for fighting, and such a good conscience that he can say, 'My neighbor compels and forces me to fight, though I had rather avoid it.' In that case, it can be called not only war, but lawful self-defense." That was an interesting quote supporting this idea, the first point of the just war theory, that defensive war alone is legitimate. The second point, it must be formally declared by proper authority. The third point of the just war theory is it has to have a just cause and right intention. Obviously, there's some subjectivity to that, but there should be a just cause and a right intention. Number 4 is last resort after all else has failed. That's why we have diplomacy. That's why we try to talk it out in word before we pull out our swords and fight it out, right? The last resort after all else has failed. Number 5, limited and unchanging objectives. Peace must be a central motive even in the midst of violence. So the limited and unchanging objective means once you get into a war and you fight it and you accomplish the purpose, you don't say, well, while we're here, we may as well do this, and while we're here, you probably should do this, and we might want to do this too, and do this as well. The just war theory would say, wait, that's beyond the perspective or the objective for which you entered the war in the first place. Okay? You go to war for peace. All right, number 6, there must be a high likelihood of success. It's kind of a no-brainer. Don't go to war if you don't think you're going to win. It's pretty low chances we're going to win here. Number 7, proportionate means. If somebody slaps you on the face, you don't pull out your your RPG or your hand grenade and blow them up. That's non-proportionate means. A just war would say, wait, we're not going to use a nuclear weapon on someone who did some small thing. There's a proportionate means issue there. And number 8, non-combatants must not be targeted. Non-combatants are often called collateral damage. Okay, why would non-combatants not be targeted? Because they're not involved in the war. They're civilians. They're not the ones attacking, so they shouldn't be attacked. Okay, so we can have a whole presentation on the just war theory, and in some ways we are today. And I don't want to go into the details of that, except to point out those 8 defining factors help, at least from my perspective, and I think it's still a current theory that's floating around out there. The just war theory says you meet these obligations, you can comply with these terms, and then you have a justified war. So I think as Americans, we have a war that we were engaged in that we all feel was justified. It was the war for independence, right? And so an interesting thing that I did, I compared the just war theory to the Declaration of Independence, because the Declaration kind of says why we went to war. And it's interesting when you start to make these comparisons. On the left-hand side, we're going to set up a little chart here that talks the original wording of the Declaration. And on the right-hand side, we're going to have the just war theory that corresponds. Okay? So first of all, the Declaration says this, quote, a nation should declare the cause which impels them to the separation. Okay? That equates and corresponds with the just war theory that says it must be formally declared by proper authority. Okay, see the declaration there. Now, the Declaration of Independence says, appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions. The founders said, look, we're so sure about what we're doing that we're going to appeal to God himself to say, judge us for what we're doing. We feel like it's right. Okay? Now, the just war theory that goes along with that is this idea of just cause and right intention. Okay? That our just cause and right intention, we feel so right about it, we're going to have God judge us. Another thing that the founders put together was this idea in the Declaration that says, to prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. Not only are we going to let God judge us, we feel so right about what we're doing that we're going to submit facts to a candid world. Let them judge us for the justness and the rightness of our intention. Okay? So, kind of 2 interesting things they use that apply to that just war theory of just cause and right intention. Next one, they say governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. You don't just change, something went wrong, we're going to change a whole government. No. We're not going to do that. That corresponds with the just war theory that says the damage inflicted by the aggressor nation must be lasting, grave, and certain. Do you see the correlation there? Okay. Nextly, the Declaration, in keeping the same just war theory principle there, when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism. Okay? Over and over and over, the same pattern. It's lasting, it's grave, it's certain. Okay? And one more point they made that corresponds. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations. Okay? Repeated. Over and over. Lasting, grave, and certain. Next, the Declaration says, such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies. And that corresponds to the idea that it's a last resort after all else has failed. That the colonies patiently suffered over and over and over. They didn't want to go to the war. They tried to resolve things. They tried to communicate with the King of Britain. They tried to talk about how to fix these issues. Okay? And those things didn't happen, didn't occur. Lastly, the Declaration says it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government, which to me corresponds to the idea that defensive war is legitimate. It becomes their duty and their right at some point when they've been oppressed over and over and over and over. The founders said, we have no other choice in an act of defense to declare war and engage in war against the mother country. Okay? So we've all accepted the idea that war for independence was a just war, and hopefully now applying the ideas in the Declaration to the just war theory helps us legitimize it. Yeah, it was a just war. Okay? All right, so hopefully, I don't know, that's interesting to me. I hope it is to you. Now what we're going to do is we're going to get into the founders' view now. We're first going to talk about the founders' view on foreign policy. Okay, and then we're going to get into the founders' view on national defense, and then we're going to get the founders' view on war. We're going to get some interesting quotes from them. The founders' view on foreign policy, John Quincy Adams kind of has the granddaddy of them all. To me, this is a very, very applicable quote, a very true quote. He says this, America has abstained from interference in the concerns of others, even when the conflict has been for principles to which she clings. Isn't that an interesting concept? There may be these principles of freedom to which other governments are fighting or people are fighting, etc. But he says, even when the conflict has been for principles to which she clings, America abstains from interference. Okay? in the concerns of others. He continues, she goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own. Now, that's a pretty powerful quote, but it's actually a pretty foreign policy to the current foreign policy that we have, isn't it? It's quite opposite. No, we don't go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Well, actually, that's quite a bit what America is doing, finding different dictators that are bad and going out and policing the world in a lot of ways. Okay? Now, whether or not you agree whether that should happen, I'm simply saying that our current foreign policy is very much different than the original intent of our foreign policy according to the founders. Washington would agree. He says, Europe has a set of primary interests which have to us none or very remote relation. Okay? Hence, she must be engaged in frequent controversies, the causes of which are essentially foreign to our concerns. Hence, therefore, it must be unwise in us to implicate ourselves by artificial ties in the ordinary vicissitudes of her politics or the ordinary combinations and collusions of her friendships or enmities. Okay, the history of Europe has been, boy, we're all entangled with these alliances. You're my friend, and if you insult my friend, then I'm going to attack you, and if you attack them, then I'm going to fight. And what happens, right? You look at World War I. That's exactly what happened. The killing of the Archduke Ferdinand and his wife by a rebel Serb in Austria. Next thing you know, we have World War I, right? Because everyone's connected. George Washington says, wait, those aren't our concerns. We shouldn't entangle ourselves with the imagination of artificial ties and these entangling alliances. Of course, there's the famous quote we're going to get to by Jefferson in a second that talks about that. Washington substantiates this and says, it is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. Okay, we're not going to associate and ally ourselves, make alliances with any portion of the world. We're an independent nation that is not dependent on anyone else. And other people's actions are not going to impel us to act a certain way. Jefferson says this, I deem one of the essential principles of our government to be peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. Okay? So I don't know, hopefully you see with John Quincy Adams and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, they're very clear about what our foreign policy intent is. It's nice to get their quotes to understand the intent behind what they formed in the Constitution. We're going to get to the Constitution and find out where these principles, these ideas show up in the actual words of the Constitution, but it's nice to get that background as well. Okay? There's a man more recent, not one of the founding fathers. His name is Ezra Taft Benson. He was Secretary of Agriculture under Dwight D. Eisenhower. He said this, kind of an interesting quote. There is one and only one legitimate goal of the United States foreign policy. It's a narrow goal, a nationalistic goal, the preservation of our national independence. Nothing in the Constitution grants that the president shall have the privilege of offering himself as a world leader. He is our executive. He is on our payroll. He is supposed to put our best interest in front of those of other nations. He continues, nothing in the Constitution nor in logic grants to the President of the United States or Congress the power to influence the political life of other countries, to uplift their cultures, to bolster their economies, to feed their people, or even defend them against their enemies. Pretty bold statement, right? But it coincides with this idea of Washington and Jefferson. No entangling alliances. We're not going to get involved in that. Okay? We're not going to uplift other people's cultures and economies or fight their enemies for them. It goes along with the same idea of our founders. Okay? One thing that's tied into that is foreign aid. An interesting fact, interesting thing to know, in 2013, America sent $37 billion overseas in foreign aid. Okay? With about 100 million taxpayers in America, that equates to about $500 per taxpayer being sent overseas to take care of uplifting their economies, bolstering their cultures, right? The things that Ezra Taft Benson talked about. I just want to break down who are the top 5 countries that are receiving foreign aid. Israel receives $3.1 billion. Afghanistan, $2.3 billion. Pakistan, $2.1 billion. Iraq, $1.7 billion. Egypt, $1.6 billion. In the billions. We talk about billions all the time. It's not a big deal. Billions is a big deal. It's a lot of money. We've given that much money overseas, okay, in foreign aid. And you look at these countries and you start to, wait, there's a pattern here. Some of those countries we've had conflicts with. Some of those countries we're giving foreign aid to, and they're not reciprocating anything. In fact, they've been our enemies in some cases. Okay? I'll let you make the tie there. There's some interesting money issues when it comes down to that foreign policy and the war that goes along with that and the money that could be made or lost. Okay? That's for you to kind of tie together. Now we're going to switch over to the founder's view on national defense. Okay? Hamilton had this to say: "Safety from external danger is the most powerful director of national conduct." Okay, people want to be safe from an external danger. He says, "Nations the most attached to liberty resort to institutions which have a tendency to destroy their civil and political rights." Okay, we're attached to liberty, but boy, when there's some insecurity there, we have a tendency to say, "Oh, just let me bind myself to this institution, this leader," and they tend to destroy their political rights and their civil rights. He ends by saying this very clearly: to be more safe, they run the risk of being less free, which should remind us of a quote by Benjamin Franklin. This is a famous quote. He says, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." Okay? As I've studied, at least in my studies, the way I look at things, this security idea and this freedom idea, they're polar opposites. If you want security, we can guarantee you security. Hitler can guarantee security. Give me your guns, give me all your laws, give me all your youth, give me all your education. I'll guarantee security, right? Communism, that's what communism does. Security and freedom. I want to be free. And Benjamin Franklin says, look, if you want that freedom, there's a price that comes with that. You can't have liberty and try to purchase liberty by giving up, or purchase security by giving up liberty. You will get neither. Okay? One last quote. I know we're getting a lot of quotes in here, but I think it's interesting to get the intent of the founders. This is the last one, National Defense by James Madison. "The means of defense against foreign danger historically have become the instruments of tyranny at home." This is an interesting quote to remember. We're going to talk about it later in the presentation. "The means of defense against foreign danger historically have become the instruments of tyranny at home." Okay? The building up of defensive measures historically, not theoretically, it's just talking about history. Looking back in time, what have they done? They've been the proper tools in the way that the government can tyrannize their own people at home. Okay? Interesting. So that's national defense. Now we're going to move on to the founders' view on war. And this principally revolves around one quote from Madison that I think is quite powerful. He says, "Of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded, because it comprises and develops the germ of every other." What does he mean by this? He clarifies, war is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes to pay for the war, right? And armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. Okay? He ends by saying this: "No nation can preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare." Luckily, America hasn't been continually at war ever since the United Nations was brought to pass, right? 1945? Oh, wait. No, we have been continually at war since 1945. Perpetually. And what does Madison say? No nation can preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. Is he right? Yeah, I think he may be right. There may be some war that is destroying our freedoms, right? Think about the Patriot Act. Think about all the NSA issues and such, okay? And some people would say, well, the war on terror isn't really a war on terror. It's a war on us, on our freedoms, on our rights. Okay? Something to kick around. Now, this next slide is fairly controversial. Some people say, Jeff, you've got your head in the sand. You don't realize what a dangerous and wicked world it is out there. You need to be a little more open-minded, and that's all right. I guess that's what's good about America. We can all agree to disagree. The facts I want to present to you, I think, may tell a story that you may not feel comfortable with, or you may. But I just want to point out what I think is interesting in these facts. Okay, the first thing, the U.S. military budget has doubled since the year 2000. Okay? Now, all we hear is that military is getting cut back. And yet the fact is, since the year 2000, our military budget has doubled. Now, when we hear about cutting back, it may be the same like the budget, right? We say, hey, we're cutting back. We're not really cutting back. What we're saying is it was going to be a 15% increase, and now it's only a 13% increase. And therefore, we're cutting back billions of dollars. Well, not really. We're cutting back in the increase. Okay, maybe that's what's going on there too, in the military area. Next point, U.S. spends more annually on military, $682 billion, than the next 10 highest spending countries combined. And when you talk about Russia and China and Pakistan and India, all these, the next 10 highest spending countries combined isn't as much as the single highest spending, which is America. Okay? $682 billion has an asterisk there. The reason I put the asterisk is because if you apply that same standard of 100 million taxpayers in the United States of America, then that means each taxpayer is tagged with about $6,800 in spending for the military. Okay? Some of you say, well, that's not me because I actually get a refund on my taxes. I don't spend $6,800 in taxes. Actually, you do. Okay? Whether you spend it in the form of taxes or it's spent for you by the Federal Reserve and then you're on the hook to pay for it, your portion of that is $6,800. Okay? And remember, we're 17 trillion in the hole as we speak. At least that's the admitted debt the government admits to. $682 billion we're spending on military. Now, point number 3 is the United States has over 500 military facilities in over 135 nations. Okay? Some people will say, well, we need that many. We need more. I look at that number and I say that's high. I say it's very high. 500 military facilities. Okay, that's a lot. There's some people who said there's more like 735. There's other people who have been quoted as saying 900. So 500 is kind of a low bar. In fact, half as many as some people say. To have 500 military facilities. Some would argue, well, that means it could just be one Marine in one country. Well, yeah, that's true. That could be that one of those 500, but 500 is a lot of military facilities. The double asterisk here points me to the idea, the question I was going to ask is, where in the Constitution is the authority to the establishment of those military facilities? Is it there? It's not there. There is no establishment or no clause in the Constitution that grants authority to the United States of America to have over 500 military facilities permanently set up throughout the world. Okay? I think that's a high number. I really do. Fourth, U.S. currently has 250,000 personnel in over 100 countries. Once again, that seems high to me. 250,000. The U.S. still has 30,000 troops in Korea, 50,000 in Germany, 40,000 in Japan, 10,000 in Italy, and 10,000 in the UK. Okay, that's a lot of numbers. That's a lot of people. And when I think about those being Americans out there, military establishments and bases throughout the world, 250,000 is 250,000 moms and dads. 250,000 moms and dads who have to be away from their family. I see that as a challenge. I see that as a major problem in our nation. One of the things that's really plaguing our nation is the downfall of the family, and how can we have those families really intact, etc., when there's 250,000 moms and dads serving abroad. Once again, that's not a critique of the people doing that. They're doing that honorably, and they're doing that and standing in harm's way. But it is a critique of the leaders who have established that huge military-industrial complex. Okay? I'd say, what are they doing there? Some people say, well, they're protecting. Well, I would say, let them protect themselves. That may sound mean. I'm not trying to sound mean. I'm trying to say, bring them home. What if the 30,000 troops in Korea were brought home and stuck on the border? We might be able to fix our border issues, our immigration issues. I don't know. Obviously, that can be controversial. People in the service could be very offended by that comment. I'm not meaning it to be offensive to the person. I am meaning it to critique the wisdom of having 250,000 Americans abroad. I think that might be a challenge. The U.S. Navy has 280 ships and submarines. The U.S. has 10 aircraft carriers in service, but no other country has more than 2 in service. Okay? The question I have is, if we are not at war, then what in the world are we doing? And the pun is intended. What in the world are we doing? What are we doing if we're not at war? With just huge amounts of money and people and supplies and resources across the world. Okay? I know that people would have answers for that. And I'd like to say, well, let's look at what our foreign policy, our national defense, and our war stance should be according to the founders' intent. Now we're going to look at what the Constitution has to say, okay? So we're going to bring that home and say, we could debate on this. We could say, well, what about this and what about that? Well, there could be a debate. I would say the founders are on the side of maybe a more conservative viewpoint on that. The Constitution happens to be on that same side as well, and we'll talk about that. I'm not trying to be harsh or critical. There is a quote that I think that maybe wraps up, sums up for me some of these ideas. It's by a man named Spencer W. Kimball. He says this: "We are a warlike people, easily distracted from our assignment of preparing for the coming of the Lord. When enemies rise up, we commit vast resources to the fabrication of gods of stone and steel, ships, planes, missiles, fortifications, and depend on them for protection and deliverance. When threatened, we become anti-enemy instead of pro-kingdom of God. We train man in the art of war and call him a patriot, thus in the manner of Satan's counterfeit of true patriotism, perverting the Savior's teaching. Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven." An interesting quote to consider. Once again, I have to be crystal clear. I'll openly admit I'm not an insider. I don't understand all the military affairs of the nation. Some may say, no, there's completely justified. Maybe I'll simply state from an outsider's point of view, that's a lot of resources. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of lives on the line to be doing external policing of the world or getting involved in international affairs. Okay, I'll end with a quote by James Madison. In no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which confides the question of war or peace to the legislature, not to the executive department. Okay, so that gives us a segue into finding out what does the Constitution have to say about these three things. We're going to reverse order now. We're going to talk about war first, and then national defense, and then foreign policy. So the Constitution on war, the classic, very, very simple Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11. We've talked about this in many other presentations. Congress shall have power to declare war. So what does that mean, especially prior to the 17th Amendment, which took out the states' representation in the federal government? But before the 17th Amendment, a declaration of war by Congress meant the people who represented the House and the states who represented in the Senate both agreed to dedicate their resources and their blood to the cause. So if they're the ones who are sacrificing both what they have and who they are, shouldn't they be the ones who decide through their elected officials? It shouldn't be the president, right? That only makes sense, just like Madison said. It shouldn't be the president because the history of war has been the history of vindictive kings and potentates and jealousies, fighting back and forth and using the people as pawns. If the people are going to do this, they need to be behind that. Okay, so it makes sense that Congress shall declare war. Is there anything that happened 6 months before launching the 2003 attack in Iraq? Representative Ron Paul offered a motion to declare war on Iraq and then said he intended to vote against his own motion because he didn't think the U.S. should be attacking Iraq. He did this to show his opposition to the idea that we can't ignore the Constitution's requirement that only Congress can declare war. Okay, so Representative Ron Paul said, I want to have a congressional declaration of war, and I'm going to vote against that, making the point that no one else can declare war, only we can declare war. Henry Hyde, who's the ranking chairman of the International Relations Committee, is a Republican from Illinois, says this, quote, there are things in the Constitution that have been overtaken by events, by time. Declaration of war is one of them. There are things no longer relevant to modern society. We are saying to the president, use your judgment. Your measure, Representative Paul, is inappropriate, anachronistic. It isn't done anymore. Okay, so the ranking Republican says, oh, come on, that's outdated. We don't follow Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 anymore. That's anachronistic. Now, it's interesting to note, 1 week later, the House authorized the president to use the armed forces of the United States as he deems necessary to enforce all relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions regarding Iraq. In this authorization, the UN is mentioned 21 different times. And was the Constitution ever mentioned? No. Okay? Now, there's a non-delegation principle here. If you delegate power to someone to make a decision in your behalf, they can't take that power and give it to someone else, which is exactly what happened here. Okay? We, the people, have delegated through our state, the Senate, through the House, the ability to declare war. Okay, to obligate us to go to war. Now, if we give them that decision-making power and they say, oh no, we're not going to have that power anymore, we're going to give it to somebody else. You can't do that. That's a violation of principle. If I authorize someone to act for me as my agent and that person doesn't want to do it and he gives it to somebody else, that's a problem, isn't it? If they don't want to do it, they need to give it back to me and I'll choose who's my new agent. They don't just choose for me. That's a problem. That's something that's been violated over and over with the UN. Okay? When's the last time we've already talked about this over and over. When's the last time the United States Congress declared war? In World War II. Okay, we've been perpetually at war since then. The UN is supposed to be this great peace organization, yet there's been war after war after war since then. Okay? Now, Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3 says, no state shall, without the consent of Congress, engage in war, unless actually invaded or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay. I like this one because it gives some insight, because it's contextual information behind why you ever do go to war. Well, this says, when you're in such imminent danger as and will not admit of delay when you're actually attacked or invaded. It only makes sense. Of course, natural law says if I'm attacked, I'm going to defend myself. Okay? It gives us a little bit of an insight into the founders saying why you would go to war. Other war powers, I call this slide. In Article 1, Section 8, Clause 10, and in the next one as well, the next couple, it says, Congress shall have power to define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas and other offenses against the law of nations. And this might bring to mind the idea of Barbary pirates. What were Barbary pirates doing? They're saying, look, if you want to go in the Mediterranean waters, you better pay us off and bribe us, otherwise we'll destroy your ships. Okay? And Article 1, Section 8, Clause 10 gives a provision for who? For Congress, not for the president, for Congress to define and punish those piracies. What does that do? That helps us so we don't have to declare war on Morocco because some live there. Some Barbary pirates live there. In Libya because some of them live there and some live... No. The Congress is going to define and punish those piracies of the specific pirates. Okay? So we don't have to declare war expansively. We can declare war simply on them. Okay? The next, in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, goes much along with this. It says, Congress shall have power to grant letters of marque and reprisal. What do letters of marque and reprisal, what does that mean? In short, there's a longer definition, but in short, it means a bounty on someone's head. Okay? So if someone were to come into America, wreak havoc, destroy world trade centers, okay? According to the Constitution, instead of having to declare war on an adjective, on terror, they can put a bounty on someone's head and say, look, if we're spending $682 billion, we better know who did that, and let's go get them. Them and their followers, those people are responsible. We don't have to declare war on a country. We don't have to declare war on a cause. We can declare war on those individuals who did that thing. Okay? It's an interesting concept. These ideas, when you look at, I think they're fabulous. They're fascinating. They're in the Constitution. They already have solutions for the things that are happening. When we make decisions that are outside the Constitution, then there's some challenges. Okay? Lastly, in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, the last part says, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. The point to be made here is who makes those rules? Congress. Congress makes the rules because Congress is the one in charge of the resources and the lives of the people who are involved in that. And Congress can see the unintended consequences. We can debate this. We can think it over. We don't just have one man who says, well, we're going to do this. That becomes a knee-jerk reaction. It's not something that's wise and thought out in relation to war and our foreign policy. Okay? Once again, I hope I'm being clear. I'm not trying to attack individuals. I'm not trying to attack causes. And I know there are great men and women in the armed services who feel very loyal, and so they should. Okay, what I'm trying to do is question where we're sending these good men and women. Why are we putting them in harm's way? What are we doing in putting their lives on the line for something that may not be constitutional nor principle-based? Okay, now we're going to go on to the Constitution on national defense. What does the Constitution itself have to say about national defense? Article 4, Section 4, Clause 1 says the United States shall protect each state against invasion. So who's in charge of protecting the whole United States from invasion? The United States, okay? Very clear. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 gives us some insight into how that would be accomplished. It ends by saying the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings. So how would they do that? The United States can't protect the nation from invasion within the 10 square miles of D.C. They have to be able to build forts and magazines and arsenals and dockyards all the way around the edges of the United States in order to, or within as well, in order to protect the United States against invasion. Okay? The previous part to Clause 17 there is under some certain conditions. They can have the land to do those things if the state legislature allows them and if they purchase that. Okay? We talked about that in our property rights presentation. But it's important that they can do so, and it's their job to do so. Okay? They've been tasked with protecting us against invasion, so yes, they need to have the opportunity to provide forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings in that pursuit. Now let's go back to Article 4, Section 4, Clause 1 and look at the rest of it, because it says, and on the application of the legislature, meaning the state legislature, or the executive, meaning the governor, when the legislature cannot be convened against domestic violence. So very clearly, the federal government can come into the individual states to help them with domestic violence upon what condition? If the state invites them. If the state invites them. And what does that do? It establishes clear jurisdictional lines. Within the state of Wyoming, we're in charge. If you want to come in, you can't unless we invite you. Okay? That makes sense. There's jurisdiction. There's a line of authority established within the state. Okay? Now, take that same principle, that same application. Let's first look at it as an individual level. Do I as an individual see a problem in my neighbor, and can I use force to enter into that house and say, you will do it this way, or there will be some physical consequences? Can I do that as an individual? If I can't, which I can't, then I can't delegate to my agent government to do that on my behalf. Okay? Just like the United States can't come into any individual state and say, you're going to do this way, we're going to take charge here. The United States also can't go to other nations and say, we're here to take charge and tell you how to fix your problems. That's not our role. That defies logic. It defies the Constitution. Okay? I think that gives us some insight there. Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3, no state shall, without the consent of Congress, keep troops or ships of war in times of peace. Okay? Making sure you understand these troops of war, these ships of war, they're under the jurisdiction of who? Of Congress. So the Constitution also defines and delineates the jurisdiction in issues about war. War is for who? The national level, for Congress to be in charge of. Matters of war are not left up to the states. Okay? So there's some jurisdictional things lined out. I don't know I don't know how you guys see things, but I love looking at the Constitution because all these things are in there. We've talked about probably 20 clauses so far that deal with national defense and war and foreign policy. It's interesting to see that it's written out there. We don't just say, well, what do we do? There's a whole new world. No, what we do is we look to the Constitution. We're a republic. Republic means rule of law. Follow our law. It's there. Okay? Now we're going to take a little segue here into looking at the Army specifically, and then the Navy, and then the militia. Okay? What we're going to do is we're going to do the constitutional definition of the Army, then the constitutional operating standards of the Army during peace, and the constitutional operating standards of the Army during war, and do the same for the Navy. Okay, those 3 issues, and the militia, those 3 issues. Okay? So let's start with the Army. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 12, Congress shall have power to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years. Okay? And I've underlined the word raise. Raised armies as opposed to standing armies. Okay? Madison had this to say, a standing army is one of the greatest mischief that can possibly happen. Now you apply that to his previous quote. Remember his previous quote that talked about the means of defense against foreign enemies historically have become the instruments of tyranny at home, right? Because a standing army says we're going to turn on our own people. Historically, that's what's happened. That's the tool that government uses to tyrannize their own people. Okay? So it's a mischief to have a standing army. Here's an interesting question. Can there be a standing army during times of peace? Okay? Well, we have to look at the Constitution. What's it say? If you review Article 1, Section 8, Clause 12, it doesn't say only during times of war. It seems nice, and theoretically it'd be really nice to say, look, we're only going to have an army when there's been a congressionally declared war, okay? And therefore we have a congressionally raised army to fight that war. That'd be nice. But there are times when Congress can be informed, look, there's an attack pending, there's things happening, we need to have an army ready to go, okay? Can that happen? Yeah. There's two conditions in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 12. It says, first, Congress is in charge, okay? They're the ones who authorize that army to be raised, okay? So they can think that all the unintended consequences, they're taking the people's resources and people themselves, so the people should be able to decide through their Congress. And secondly, no appropriation of money to that use should be for a longer term than 2 years. So it's very narrow, lengthwise, time-wise, power to raise that army. Okay, so they can be raised by Congress and for a term less than 2 years. If there's a war that lasts longer than 2 years, can they appropriate money? Yes, but only every 2 years they have to revisit that decision. They have to make that decision. Why? What happens every 2 years in the United States? The House is reelected. The people's representatives are reelected. And if they don't like that we're spreading and being the police force of the world, they can elect someone else who has a different policy, is going to follow the constitutional policy behind that, okay? But there is no restriction. You can't have standing armies during times of peace. But the principle of freedom is we don't want to have a standing army that can turn on its people, because historically that's what they've done. All right? Going on to the standard operating procedures of the Army during times of peace. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 14 says, Congress shall have power to make rules for the government and regulation of the land forces. Okay, who's in charge of making rules and regulations for the Army? Congress, right? That's what it says. Not the president. Anybody heard of don't ask, don't tell? Who made that rule? President Clinton, okay? The executive made that rule. The president. Does the president have the authority to make rules and regulations for the Army? No. Okay, very clearly. That's what Article 1, Section 8, Clause 14 says. All right? A lot of people point to the Commander-in-Chief clause. They well, no, the president's the Commander-in-Chief. He's in charge. Well, let's look at what it says. Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1, the president shall be the Commander-in-Chief of the Army. Whenever there's a power granted in the Constitution, there's always a corresponding condition. What's the condition? When they're called into the actual service of the United States. Who calls armies into the actual service of the United States? Congress does. And when Congress calls them into the actual service, then the president becomes the commander-in-chief. So the president is not an ever-present president of an ever-present army. He's the commander-in-chief once Congress calls him into the actual service of the United States. There's a huge difference there. It's not very well understood. Everyone tends to think, well, the president is always the perpetual commander-in-chief. He's only the commander-in-chief when, according to Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1, when called into the actual service of the United States by Congress. Congress declares war. Congress raises the army. Congress appropriates. All right? There's a distinction there. It's important to understand. And it's important to remember, when that decision is made about war, it should be the thoughts of 535 congressmen, House and Senate, getting together, thinking about all the unintended consequences, the commitment, the monetary and life, blood commitment to the war. Do we want to do this? They should be the ones making that decision, not the president, okay? And he's only the commander-in-chief. Because once you get to war, you want that war to be finished as quickly as possible. War is brutal and ugly. We want to get in there and get done. So what needs to be done? We need to have one person execute that war. And a well-defined and well-declared war will help that president execute it and get out. Make that happen and be done with it. Okay? Well-declared war. And we need to have one person. Can you imagine how it would be to have a war with 535 generals trying to decide how to do it? No, we need one who's going to make it happen. Okay? That's a principle that makes sense. Now, a little review here. Who declares war? Congress, right? Who raises the army and finances them? Congress. Who makes rules for the army? Congress. Who makes decisions about the use of the army when it is called into the actual service of the United States, for example, to fight a declared war? That's when the president makes those decisions. But Congress is in charge of declaring, raising and financing, making the rules. The president's only the commander-in-chief once all those things have happened. Remember, at a very basic level, what does the legislative branch do? They make decisions. They make rules. What does the executive branch do? They carry out, they execute those laws and those rules, those decisions. Congress makes decisions. President executes the decision. It's the same in war. Okay? Let's go on to the Navy. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 13. Congress shall have power to provide and maintain a Navy. Now, does that sound like a raised Navy or a standing Navy? Standing, right? To maintain a Navy is a standing Navy. Why would that be? Why would the founders say we're fine with having a standing Navy, just not a standing Army? Why a standing Navy? In my mind, there's at least three reasons. One is a Navy, by definition, is a defensive unit, okay? It's the only way we're going to get attacked in the past was with the Navy by sea protecting us. It's a defensive unit. Secondly, if we need to have a ship, can we say, hey, we need a ship tomorrow, we're being attacked? No. It takes a while to build up a Navy, doesn't it? So it makes sense to have a standing Navy for that regard. Thirdly, and one of the most important ones, I think, is how easily can an army tyrannize their own people? Really easily, right? How easily can a Navy tyrannize their own people? Not too easy, just along the shoreline, correct? So for those three reasons, they said, let's have a Navy that's standing, that's maintained. Okay? So there's a difference there between the Navy and the Army. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 14, these rules and regulation of the Navy, Congress shall have power to make rules for the government and regulation of the naval forces. Okay? There may be a little bit of a gray area here because the Navy is a standing unit, so shouldn't the commander-in-chief always be the standing president? Okay? People may say, well, that's a gray area there. Well, what it says very clearly is Congress has the power to make the rules and regulations for the naval forces. That's what the Constitution says. Let's look at it in a little bit more detail. Let's go to the Commander-in-Chief clause again. It says the President shall be the Commander-in-Chief of the Navy of the United States. The condition again is when they're called into the actual service of the United States. Okay? The Navy is ever present, but when they are called into the service of the United States by Congress, okay, that's when he becomes the Commander-in-Chief. Now, if there's any discrepancy there, let's go back. Let's go back to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 14. Congress shall have power to make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces. It explicitly says, the Constitution explicitly says that the Congress is in charge of making the rules and regulations of the naval forces. If they didn't want that to happen, they just wanted the Commander-in-Chief to make all the rules, then they would have left out the naval forces, but they didn't. They included that. Okay? So even though the Navy is standing, the Army is a raised army, it's still the same provisions. Congress has to call them into actual service in the United States, and then the president becomes the commander-in-chief. All right? So let's move on. The first was Army, Navy, and now the third one is militia. Whoops, I just gave you the answer here, okay? James Madison, a blank is the best, most natural defense in a free country. He says a well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people, trained in arms, is the best, most natural defense in a free country. A lot of people say, and this is very true, what are you saying, Jeff, that we just kind of sit around and who knows what's going to happen? Someone attacks us and okay, now we have to pull up an army. We have to... No, what I'm saying is if we had, and we talked about this in my gun control in the Constitution presentation very thoroughly about the militia, if we had a militia already there, we would have 100 million strong standing army, right? Anyone dare attack us, we'd be ready, mustered, ready to go to defend ourselves already. That's why Japan didn't attack us, they said. Their general said, there's going to be a gun behind every door and bush. We're not going to go attack them. Okay? That's what should happen with the militia. And then we already have that protective force. So we have the initial defensive unit already in place. And if we need to raise an army and appropriate funds for that, we can. But the militia is self-defense because free citizens are ready and available and always have the duty and responsibility to defend themselves. Okay? That's why he calls it the best and most natural defense in a free country. Now, let's look a little bit more about the militia clause. We're not going to go into a lot of detail. Like I said, in gun control in the Constitution, we spent 20 minutes talking about this. So we're just going to hit some highlights that apply to what we talked about earlier with the Army and Navy. Congress shall have power to provide for calling forth the militia. If you remember, the militia is an entity of the state, and the governor is in charge of the militia. So if Congress wants to call them forth, who do they call them forth from? From the governor. And the governor can say yes or no, correct? Okay? And when Congress calls them forth, the governor says, yes, that's all right. They can only call them forth for 3 reasons. And they're listed in Clause 15. To execute the laws of the Union, to suppress insurrections and repel invasions. Those are all internal domestic reasons, not external, international, foreign reasons. Okay? There's a huge difference there, and we talk about that in the gun control presentation. Okay. Next, the Commander-in-Chief Clause. The President shall be the Commander-in-Chief of the militia of the several states. Anyone want to guess under what condition? When called into the actual service of the United States. Okay, so once again, he's not the Commander-in-Chief of the militia until Congress asks the governor. The governor says yes. They're called into service for 3 specific reasons, one of those, and then the Commander-in-Chief is the President. Then he becomes the Commander-in-Chief. Okay, so it follows that same pattern. Once again, another quiz here. Who's in charge of local defense? The militia. Who's in charge of national defense? Congress. And now, which organizations are under Congress's direction? First, the Navy, which is a standing Navy. Secondly, the state militias, which is also standing at the local level, but they have to be called up by Congress for specific purposes. Okay? And lastly, the Army, which must be raised by Congress. Those are the tools that Congress has to use in our national defense. Who makes the rules for the armed forces? Congress. Who makes decisions about the use of the armed forces when called into the actual service of the United States? That's when the President does. But he can't use them however he wants to. He can only use the militia, for example, for one of those 3 purposes. Okay? The Constitution lines these things out. It has great jurisdictional lines of authority, has great jurisdiction as far as what people are supposed to do, what they aren't supposed to do, what authority is given to have standing versus raised, all these different elements. They're all in the Constitution. All right? Now we're going to move on to the Constitution on foreign policy. Okay, we just talked about war. Constitution, what it defined and talked about in war. Constitution, what it talked about national defense. And the Constitution that talked on now I was going to talk on foreign policy. Let's get some definitions out of the way real quick. These are definition words that show up in the Constitution. That's why we're defining them. An alliance or a confederation is the union between nations entered into by contract. It's a long-term, high-level commitment. Okay, that's how you think of it. Alliance or confederation is long-term. It's a union, okay, between nations. An agreement or a compact is more of a short-term, lower-level commitment. It's just a union of opinions or sentiments. All right? And lastly, a treaty. A treaty is a contract between 2 or more nations formally signed by authorized powers of each nation. It's a binding agreement to conditions. Okay? Those are some of the things that are brought up in our Constitution in regards to our foreign policy. So I want to look at some of those. Under the Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1, it refers to the states. How do the states interact with these ideas of alliances, agreements, compacts, and confederations? Well, it says, no state shall enter into any alliance or confederation. And notice, the Constitution ties those 2 together, an alliance and a confederation, because they're more long-term, high-level commitments. And it says no state shall. States can't enter into alliances and confederations, into long-term agreements. Okay? High-level commitments, they can't. Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3 says, no state shall, without the consent of Congress, enter into any agreement or compact with another state or with a foreign power. Now, this agreement or compact, remember, is a lower level, less commitment. They can enter into those agreements, but only if Congress allows them to, consents to them doing so. Okay, so it's very clear in reference to these 4 things, alliances, agreements, compacts, and confederations. States can't enter into long-term high level, but they can, with Congress's consent, enter into the kind of a low-level, light commitment agreements and compacts. On the other hand, where does it talk about the federal in relation to alliances, agreements, compacts, and confederations? Well, it's not mentioned. So the Constitution is silent on a federal power. What does that mean? Hopefully we've learned enough by now that what that means is you turn to the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment says the powers that are not delegated to the United States by the Constitution or prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Okay? So if a power is not delegated, a power to enter into an alliance or an agreement or a compact or confederation, if that power is not given, it's not there. It doesn't exist. So the federal government doesn't have the power to enter into alliances, confederations, compacts, and whichever other one I missed, agreements. Okay? According to the strict interpretation, look, if the power isn't given, it's not there. Now, there are some other mentions of the word of treaties. What's a treaty, okay? Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1 says, no state shall enter into any treaty. Pretty straightforward. States can't enter into treaties. On the other hand, the federal government has been given some authorization in regards to treaties. Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2, the president shall have power by and with the consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. So can the federal government get involved? What is a treaty? It's how other nations treat each other. That's what a treaty is. Okay? Can they get involved in that type of agreement? Yes, they can get involved in treaties. The federal government can. All right? It's interesting, though. Remember, treaties are for external. We talked about this in the gun control and probably other presentations. Treaties are for nations to decide externally how they're going to agree on things. Treaties are not for any group of nations or a nation to say, inside your state, this is how you're going to do things. Inside your nation, this is how you're going to do things. That's not what a treaty's for. Okay, because that would declare law. That would declare rules. And the only thing that declares rules and laws in our country is the legislature, not a treaty, not an international body, not an outsider. Okay, it's our elected, accountable representatives who do that. Okay, so along those lines is an interesting quote by a man named St. George Tucker, kind of an interesting name. He was a contemporary of the founders. He wrote a great book called View of the Constitution. It's an excellent book. Here's what he said in this. We need to think through this. Can a treaty do things that are reserved for Congress? Okay, here's how he says this. And it's specifically about war. Can a treaty declare war? Okay? St. George Tucker says, let it be supposed, for example, that the President and Senate should stipulate by treaty, right? Because it's the President and Senate who enter into treaties. It should stipulate by treaty with any foreign nation that in case of war between that nation and any other, the United States should immediately declare war against that nation. Kind of sounds like these UN treaties being entered nowadays. It says, let's suppose that happens. Well, it is happening, okay? Can it be supposed that such a treaty would be so far the law of the land as to take from the House of Representatives their constitutional right to deliberate on the expediency or inexpediency of such a declaration of war, and to determine and act thereon according to their own judgment? So can a treaty commit us to war? St. George Tucker brings up the great and important truth, no. Because what does that do? It only includes the President and the Senate. And Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 says, who shall declare war? Congress, which isn't the President. It's the Senate and the House. And who is the House? The people. So for a treaty to impel us to war, okay, is a violation of the Constitution. So a treaty can't violate the Constitution. A treaty can't push us into war, because what does it do? It excludes the House from being able to deliberate and decide for themselves. We're representing the people who are giving their resources and their sons and daughters to the war. They need to be included in that decision. No wonder all of the treaties that have happened, these UN treaties over and over, and the police action we've been involved in, we'll get a list of those later, has been really unsubstantiated, unconstitutional, because it's the treaty that's pushing us into war instead of Congress declaring war. Okay? Interesting. Just a little review here then. Constitutional foreign policy powers. The states, they cannot participate in alliances and confederations. The federal, they can't either. What about agreements and compacts? Yes or no, the states can't unless Congress consents for them to do so. What about agreements and compacts in the federal? No. What about treaties? States cannot enter into treaties, and the federal can. And the two stars there, the two asterisks, because they can enter into treaties if the President and 2/3 of the Senate approve it, and it can't supersede the Constitution, right? They can't declare war with a treaty or take away people's guns with a treaty. It can't supersede the Constitution. Okay? It's interesting because the federal government can't enter into any of these things except for treaties, and so what do they call everything nowadays? They call everything treaties. Or they use treaty law, they use treaty provisions to negotiate agreements and alliances and all these things. There's a challenge there. It's like a mom saying to a child, hey, you can't have a candy bar for lunch. We're not going to eat candy bars for lunch. You can eat a sandwich. And the child says, oh, well then I'll just take these candy bars and stick them between two crackers and I'll call it a sandwich. Wait, okay? Some off-limits things there that the Congress is doing, that the federal government is doing that is not allowed. Okay? All right, this is a long slide. We're going to go through it. And I'll admit, it's fairly biased and fairly heavy the way it says some of these things, okay? It's just something to get you thinking. Yeah, you'll see where I get to certain points like, well, wait a second, that's a little overboard, okay? We're going to compare constitutional foreign policy to modern-day foreign policy. A constitutional foreign policy is no entangling alliances. The modern-day foreign policy is we're the world's police force. Secondly, non-interventionism. That's the Constitution's view. Nowadays, we overthrow governments. Constitutional foreign policy was based on the Golden Rule. Our new foreign policy is spreading democracy. Okay, and we just talked about democracy in the last presentation, and if you tie those together, you see what we're getting there. And it's a quick note. If we're spreading democracy, and our form of democracy here in domestically is socialism, essentially, why wouldn't we be spreading socialism abroad? It's the same thing, isn't it? Constitutional foreign policy is blessed are the peacemakers. Modern day foreign policy is foreign interests, assets, and allies. Our constitutional national defense versus a modern day national defense, a standing defensive navy versus a standing policing navy, a well-regulated standing militia in each state versus a national guard. Okay, the difference there is expounded on in the gun control presentation. And this is one where it sounds a little bit heavy, okay? Keeps family members at home. Modern day national defense sends family members abroad. The point being simply that in a militia, men and women are going home each night to their families, whereas in a national guard, they're off fighting international wars. Constitutional war powers versus modern day war powers. Defensive war only under the Constitution. Modern day, preemptive empire building. Declared by Congress, whereas nowadays we have undeclared peacekeeping UN Security Council resolutions that do our declaring, okay? Led by Commander-in-Chief under the Constitution. Nowadays we're led by UN coalition forces. Fought by a raised army who goes home when done. Fought by standing armies and National Guard who are kept from home. And this is an overly generalized statement. War is avoided versus this idea of perpetual war. Okay? I know some of those things may be hard to swallow. You may not agree, and that's fine. That's something that we'll have to work into, or you'll never agree to. I just want to make the point of what the Constitution says, what the principles of freedom stand on. It's important to understand that and incorporate that into big decisions about money, but more importantly, people's lives when war is involved. Okay, so we've gone through some definitions regarding foreign policy, national defense, and war, and also the Constitution in relation to those three issues. And now we're going to start talking about modern-day abuses of the Constitution in relation to war. There's an interesting quote. You may have heard of a man named Hermann Goering, one of the top Nazi officials. Okay, he was brought to the Nuremberg trials, and he was asked some questions. Here's one of his responses that's really kind of heinous and grotesque. He says, "Of course the people don't want war. Why would some poor slob on a farm want to risk his life in a war when the best he can get out of it is to come back to his farm in one piece?" See the gross negligence for human life, right? Naturally, the common people don't want war, neither in Russia, nor in England, nor in America, nor for that matter in Germany. That's understood. He goes on, after all, it's the leaders of the country who determine the policy, and it's always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it's a democracy or a fascist dictatorship or a parliament or a communist dictatorship. Okay, he says it's easy to do this. It's easy to trick people into war. The leaders are the ones that make the policy. Now, there's a man named Dr. Gustav Gilbert who is questioning him, and it says this: there's one difference in a democracy, and he misnames us. We're not a democracy, we're a republic, right? We just learned that. In a democracy, the people have some say in the matter through their elected representatives. And in the United States, only Congress can declare war. Okay? Only Congress can declare war. That's true. And you can almost hear Hermann Goering laughing as he says this. He says, "Oh yeah, that's all well and good, but voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That's easy. All you have to do is tell them they are being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same in any country." Okay? Kind of some interesting words behind the scenes of an interesting person, an interesting cause. Okay? They say, look, you can bring people into war. You just have to denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. Remember those ideas that he brings up. Now there's an insider, okay? General Douglas MacArthur, 5-star general, who was relieved of his duties, probably for making comments like this. He says this: "Our government has kept us in a perpetual state of fear, kept us in a continuous stampede of patriotic fervor, with the cry of grave national emergency." Okay, this is someone who might know, he might understand. He served his whole life in the military, right? He was a 5-star general. He says there's some challenges here. "Always there has been some terrible evil at home or some monstrous foreign power that is going to gobble us up if we did not blindly rally behind it." Interesting comment from a 5-star general to substantiate what we've been saying, essentially, right? Okay, beating the war drums. We've got to rally. We've got to be at war. We've got to start fighting somewhere. We've got to go over the seas and destroy monsters, right? Okay. Why would the government do such things? Well, one answer, at least, is by a man named Smedley Butler. In 1940, he was the most decorated Marine in history. His book called War is a Racket, he said this, quote, I spent 34 years in active service as a member of the Marine Corps, and during that period I spent most of my time being a high-class muscle man for big business, Wall Street, and for the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer for capitalism. I helped make Mexico safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank to collect revenues. Now, don't read between the lines here. I'm not saying that our government is instituting terror, okay? But here's some interesting quotes about terror from Adolf Hitler. Terrorism is the best political weapon, for nothing drives people harder than a fear of sudden death. Joseph Stalin, the easiest way to gain control of a population is to carry out acts of terror. The public will clamor for such laws if their personal security is threatened. Plato, this and no other is the root from which a tyrant springs. When he first appears, he is a protector. James Madison, fairly prophetic. If tyranny and oppression come to this land, it will be in the guise of fighting a foreign enemy. Okay, since we've declared war on terror, what type of tyranny and oppression has come to our land? Very clearly, a lot of tyranny and oppression to our privacy, to the escalating debt, which is really a horrible taskmaster, to the loss of lives, etc., etc. Okay, it's an interesting comment, an interesting quote.